Welcome to Friday Fix. I'm Doc NYC Artistic Director Tom Powers. We began this weekly program in April as a direct response to the pandemic, but it was clear from the start that America's failures to adequately respond to COVID-19 were closely tied to racist history and policies that impact nearly every aspect of our society. On past episodes, we heard from Laura Limbaugh about her perspective from the South Bronx. Jean Shen described discrimination against Asian Americans. Nelson George told his family stories that reflect the high death rates among African Americans. Recently on CNN, Don Lemon framed the current moment by saying there are two viruses killing Americans, COVID-19 and racism. If we're ready to mobilize against the pandemic, we need the same urgency against racism. The pandemic made headlines with over 100,000 dead Americans. Racism kills countless more. Documentary makers like Sam Pollard, Raoul Peck, Ava DuVernay, and Stanley Nelson, to name only a few, have made this case forcefully and eloquently in their films. The failure was on white Americans, including those of us who speak against racism. We haven't done enough to change the system that favors us at the expense of others. The message I take from the protests across the United States and around the world is that change can't wait. It's not somebody else's work to do, it's all of our work. Now, I want to talk about our guests coming up. Later, we are going to hear from Marsha Smith, the president of Firelight Media in Harlem. For over 20 years, she's worked alongside Stanley Nelson, creating films about Black history, artistry, and achievement. I'll also talk to Kirby Dick and Amy Ziering, who directed several films about survivors of rape, fighting the systems that failed them. Kirby and Amy's latest film is On the Record, profiling Black women in hip hop who publicly accused the mogul Russell Simmons. So if you're a viewer who's come for a conversation about Me Too or Black Lives Matter, rest assured that is coming up. But our first guest is focused on environmental issues. Fisher Stevens won the Oscar for producing The Cove. As a director, he made the films Mission Blue and Before the Flood. He also has a long career as an actor. You can see him in the series Succession. And he's directed films about performers, including John Leguizamo's Ghetto Clown and Bright Lights, Debbie Reynolds and Carrie Fisher. His new film is called And We Go Green, about Formula E racing of electric cars. It debuted on Hulu this week. Let's watch the trailer.
Oh, sorry.
The streets of exotic Hong Kong normally hum to the tune of fossil fuel traffic. But this weekend, the streets form a racing circuit for the all-electric racing series, Formula E.
Formula E could have been created by two kinds of people, either environmentalists or racing people. It was created by me, racing guy.
We go green in Hong Kong! New York City green! It's a good start in America!
The first impression they have for motor racing is the noise. There's no noise on electric formula.
It's going to be a steep learning curve, but I'm pretty excited.
Andrea, are you okay?
It's dangerous, man.
Motorsport has always been an incubator for things that end up in road cars. Disc brakes, seat belts, all kinds of technology was pioneered at the racetrack and has ended up on everybody's road cars.
In the first year of Formula E, pretty much all the drivers talk bullshit about Formula E. They realize later that this is the future.
You don't do race, you're the king. The next race, you do a mistake. People start thinking you're not good anymore.
When I was young and I finished second, my dad would say, "Oh, here's our first loser."
Oh my goodness!
It's very painful when it doesn't go well.
I don't care what anyone else does. The only thing that I need to do here is win a championship.
Whoever hits the grassy! The Parisian wins in Paris!
like I say, I'm not an environmentalist, I'm a racing man, but I do worry about the environment. So if I can put both together, fantastic.
Okay, and
To bring in Fisher now. A second while I call him up. All right, where is he? Sometimes this machine doesn't work the way I want it to work. There he is. Okay. Fisher, I've just invited you. Oh, I know what I've got to do. I'm sorry. I've got to close this. This is why. Okay. Fisher, I've invited you, so. All right, inviting you again. All right. Sorry for that. Pause while Fisher is coming to screen. Oh, there we are. That was fast.
Whoa. Hi.
All right. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Tom.
So, you know, Fisher, I showed the film And We Go Green at the Toronto Film Festival last year, and I'm going to make a confession that when I first got it, before I watched it, I was really skeptical. I thought, I don't think there's any way I'm going to like this film, even though I grew up around car culture in Detroit. I never had any interest in car racing. But to my surprise, I got sucked into the story, and that's a credit to you and your co-director, Malcolm Benville, and your team. And, you know, we saw some of the themes teased in that trailer about the way car racing leads automobile technology, and all of us who desperately want alternative energy and to reduce carbon emissions. This is a kind of important part of the story. So I want to know how you came to this story. I think it was more as an environmentalist than as a racing fan.
Yeah, 100%. Leonardo DiCaprio and I had made a film called Before the Flood that you premiered also at Toronto Film Festival. And he called me one day and said, come meet me in Brooklyn for lunch at this racetrack. And I said, there's no racetrack in Brooklyn, man. He goes, there is now. And I lived in Brooklyn and had no idea that 7 minutes from my house on a Vespa, there was being built a electric car racetrack for a series called Formula E, which I'd never heard of because I am not a racing fan, or wasn't a racing fan. And Leo said, hey man, we should make a film about this, where we're actually approaching environmentalism through sport. And at first I was very skeptical. And I think in Leo's mind too, he thought, oh, we'll make another heavy environmental film. But once I met these guys, once I met Alejandro Agag, the mastermind behind Formula E, I realized, wow, we can tell a great story about sportsmen and being an athlete and competition at the same time, make it an environmental film, going under, using a different approach than we've got to save the planet, you know, we're burning up. So it was a great way into doing an environmental film. And it was and Formula E is a fascinating sporting event, and the drivers are fascinating people.
Now, one of the things you talk about aqua fuel and other technological innovations. I mean, can you talk about some of the stuff that you witnessed and that gives you hope coming out of this sport?
Yeah, well, basically the only framework we had going into this movie is we knew that it was one season, season 4, we were going to document. And at the end of this season, if it all worked out, the cars would be upgraded to going from 2 cars per driver to 1 car per driver. What I mean is, in this sport, because battery power and battery technology was so nascent, that these drivers actually halfway through the race had to jump out of one electric car and go into another electric car to finish a race because the battery wasn't strong enough. They didn't have the power. So we were concurrently filming the technical drive, the testing of that new battery for the next season. So we were going to see if that would work. But also that powertrain, those batteries are what these companies like Jaguar, Audi, and big car companies are using in their. Sorry about it. I tried to turn the alerts off. It didn't work. Sorry. But they are putting that technology into their cars that you and I, Tom, when we have enough money or enough time, that we will buy. And that was another thing that got me really excited about this, about making this film, is the technology in Formula E is being directly translated into these new Audis and into these new Jaguars. So like Formula One, as we have a section in the movie, the technology in Formula One would go into the Fords, into the Chryslers, into the Ferraris, into those cars that were combustible engine, polluting and spewing carbon. Now it's the opposite. And to be honest, Formula E is a much more exciting formula than Formula One. Formula One is always won by 3 teams every week. It's Mercedes, it's Ferrari, or it's Red Bull. They pump hundreds of millions of dollars into these cars, into spewing carbon. Even though they're hybrids now, they're still like carbon disasters. And Formula E is a different winner every week. So it's really competitive. It's technical. The drivers are, we had incredible access. We opened them up, and you get to see who they really are.
You've covered environmental catastrophes and causes for hope around the world in the films that we talked about. And I'm thinking about that in relation to this national reckoning over racism that we're seeing this week. Since time and again, we see climate change issues impacting disproportionately communities of color, poor communities. Can you talk about some of the things that you've witnessed, making that connection between environmental catastrophes and communities of color?
Yeah, well, what's going on now with COVID and with police brutality is also connected to climate change, in that without a doubt, the people most affected by climate change are people of color, people of less means. You see it, the reason, the COVID is so prevalent in African Americans also because they live in polluted areas, the particles in the air of pollution. I can't even tell you. So I just did another movie in Louisiana, and there's a place called Reserve, Louisiana, which is the cancer alley of the United States. It's the most polluted, the most cancer-ridden area of the United States, and it's 70% African American. And it's because that's where the power plants are. When we go into Native American lands and we see where they're fracking, and what the fracking is doing to our Native American brothers and sisters. In LA, we shot an incredible scene. It didn't make it in the movie, but we went to LA, to the oil fields in LA, which are in predominantly poor Black areas, and the rates of cancer in those areas are out of control. Why are we still drilling for oil in downtown Los Angeles, in Edgewood, Los Angeles? Why are we still doing this? So it's all connected. And actually, a film I'm starting to work on with a bunch of incredible filmmakers is that's kind of the next film that we're looking at doing is. And it was based on a cover story in the New York Times, is why African Americans are so affected by COVID, but it's also why African Americans are so affected by climate change. So, yeah, what you say is right. The beauty of Formula E is that it actually brings these races to the cities, and it's a lot cheaper to go see a Formula E race. And like in Brooklyn, it's the people that you see at that race in Brooklyn is not the normal makeup you see of people going to see races in motorsport races in the rest of the world. So hopefully people will get more involved in electric car racing, but at the same time, this that we're facing right now with COVID, with racial injustice, it's all connected to climate change. And I don't know, Tom, but what really worries me is it's hurricane season. And my friends in New Orleans already told me that they've been put on alert for a hurricane, and it's the middle of COVID. And what is going to happen? I mean, this is very, very scary. So they can't just pick up and get on a plane and get out of there, a lot of people. So,
yeah. We've got a few more minutes with you. I want to ask a question that came in for a viewer that was asking about the access you had with Formula E. If you had to pull any punches to maintain a good relationship, you are dealing with big stakeholders, major corporations, and so forth. How did that work?
The one thing we made, Leo was really helpful here, is that, you know, I wouldn't direct a movie where I didn't have final say, or me and Leo had final say, because we were kind of producing partners. So Formula E, the only thing we couldn't do is damage them, like, so that they get lawsuits. So other than that, we could do whatever we want. We could show whatever we want. We did have incredible access. We didn't at the beginning. We tried, and it took time to trust that they trusted us, the drivers especially, that they gained our trust, that they opened up to us. So it's not Formula One. Formula One is so corporate. It's so full of, like, you can't say a bad thing about anybody or anything. You know, the Netflix series was beautifully shot, but it was very corporate. This was just like, let's just show our veins. Let's just open up and let's just see what we get, and get the raw emotion of people, and the raw emotion and the truth. So that was something we made very clear at the beginning, that we had to be able to make the film we wanted to make, warts and all.
So my last question before I let you go, you know, we see in the fight against racism, and we see the fight against climate change, we're facing a power structure that's very comfortable with the status quo. Yeah. And I wonder, and you know, you've made these films in an effort to change people's minds. I wonder what you feel has been effective or not effective, or, you know, how you feel about this business of making films to try to change people's minds.
Well, I have to say, the interviewing Obama in Before the Flood, and he has this great line that haunts me on a daily basis, where he says, you know, Leo says, what happens if somebody elected doesn't believe in climate change? And the president goes, well, you know, it has a funny way of hitting you in the face, and it'll wake you up whether you want it to or not. Well, we have a president that you could punch in the face 100 times and he wouldn't change a damn thing. So we have to get him out of office. We have to get Mitch McConnell out of office. We have to get these people that are bought and sold by the fossil fuel industry out of office. And the irony is that these are the same people that are racist. They have racist values. They have racist and fascist tendencies. And it's crazy, the correlation between the fossil fuel industry and the climate deniers and the racial and the racists, because we could list, and in Before the Flood, we did list all of these senators that didn't believe in climate change. And these are the same senators that are doing everything they can to let the police go wild on their citizens. So there is a direct correlation that I couldn't believe when what was going on. But the other thing that you just said at the opening of this program is, I think that we have to put climate justice and racial justice together, because obviously racism and climate change are the two biggest things that we face right now as a nation and in the world. So we have to figure out how to put those things, tie those things together. And you also said that, you know, white people need to take responsibility for this. And I agree with that. You know, we are the cause, and we have to figure out a way to now really step up and support and figure out with our Black brothers and sisters, like, what can we do? How to make this change really stick, and how to make a big change. So I'm hopeful that there will be good progress with all this. And I think there's going to be a lot more pain before it actually happens, but we have to go through that pain until we really wake up once and for all. But everybody's got to vote, and we got to get rid of these racists and fascists.
Well, Fisher, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me today. I hope people get to see And We Go Green. It is really a very entertaining and interesting film.
Thank you, Tom, for having me, and good luck. Stay safe out there.
Okay, take care.
Bye-bye.
Okay, I've got our next guests on cue, Kirby Dick and Amy Ziering. Let me say a few words about their long history as directors. Their films together as co-directors include The Invisible War, exposing rape in U.S. military, that was Oscar nominated. The Hunting Ground, about rape in American campuses. Their new film is On the Record, that profiles several Black women in hip hop who publicly accused Russell Simmons of rape. The main figure in the film is Drew Dixon, pictured here in the white shirt. She was an executive at Simmons' company, Def Jam Records. She says that Simmons raped her in his apartment in 1995. Her story has details very similar to experiences that other women who have accused Simmons have reported, including Soleil Abrams and Sherry Sher in this photo. Dixon confided in her close confidence around the time of the assault, but she didn't go public for nearly 2 years until the wave of Me Too accusations in fall of 2017. Then she began to consider going on the record with the New York Times. That's when Kirby and Amy's crew started to follow her before she went public, or on the record in the film's title. Their portrayal is unlike anything I've ever seen because it allows us to watch the emotional cost of bringing that kind of accusation while it's happening. Let's watch the trailer for On the Record.
And this is the demo for Junior Mafia. I think actually Biggie gave me this. At the time, Biggie lived around the corner. He was trying to be a rapper. I was trying to be a rap A&R person. We were all trying to be something.
Drew was a young, powerful something who cared so much about this music.
And so when Def Jam called me, I was like, Russell Simmons wants to offer you this job as the director of A&R at Def Jam. I could not have scripted it better.
That's one of the beautiful things about the music industry. There was a lot of mobility for women, but at the same time, there was tremendous amount of sexual harassment.
You didn't get a lot of sympathy for that. That was considered the price of admission. I didn't tell that many people about what happened with Russell. He just grabbed me. He just grabbed me. And I'm saying no. I was reduced to nothing in that moment. Nothing about anything that makes me who I am mattered.
I had asked her, do you want to go to the police? She was like, no one's going to take me seriously. Who's going to believe me?
If white women are not believed, what do you think is happening to Black women in America when we come forward with stories about sexual violence?
I don't have a stitch of violence in me. I would never hurt anyone.
You're worried as a Black woman that you'll say something that will have consequences that you hadn't anticipated.
He's the king of hip hop. The Black community won't hate my guts. I didn't want to let the culture down. I love the culture.
It's a terrible burden to bear, to know that you might still be judged as somehow being a traitor.
The New York Times probably even said there were other women. They will go on the record unless I go on the record. But I'm terrified of the backlash.
We need to be able to make sure that a broader group of women are introduced into the public consciousness.
This is so emblematic of what happens to women routinely. It's a loss for all of us. It really, really is. I've been alone for 22 years. I thought it was just me.
To go through the assault and then the coming forward.
Everybody was taught things happen, you just didn't talk about it. And so I just always put on this front.
Every woman's story deserves to be heard.
I've been a victim for 22 years. I'm tired of being a victim.
So before I bring on Kirby and Amy, I want to give a little bit more of the history. Last December, the film was announced to premiere at the Sundance Film Festival. Simmons began to lobby against it behind the scenes. Oprah Winfrey, who was the film's executive producer, chose to withdraw from the project, and the film's distribution went with her. That made for a tense build-up to Sundance. With Oprah no longer on the project, the question sharpened about what it meant for two white filmmakers to be telling this story. Drew Dixon gave her own response at the Sundance premiere. You can watch a recording of it on YouTube, but the audio isn't great, so I want to quote her here. She said, "Nobody told our story because the people who knew our story were subject to the entertainment industry. And to me, this is where allies matter. This is why the filmmakers are white. They don't have the same vulnerability. They listened and they deferred and they learned and they centered us. Now, as a quote that I don't want to generalize, I can point to Surviving R. Kelly as an example of a Black filmmaker, Dream Hampton, who confronted power in hip hop. But Dixon was speaking from her own experience, and that gives an important context. The film was bought by HBO Max and released last week. There are still lingering questions around Oprah pulling out that continued to come up in reviews. More than once, I saw a version of this sentiment from a writer in Essence magazine. She said, "I was preemptively skeptical that any story about Black women being assaulted by a Black man could be told effectively by white filmmakers. Then I watched it." And she goes on to describe being wholly persuaded by the film's testimony. Now, the release is coming out. It came out on HBO Max last week at a time when the country is churning over a different conversation. Me Too founder Tarana Burke reflected on that last week in a tweet about On the Record. She said, "Oftentimes when Black women speak up and out, people tell us it's not the time. But I know folks can carry on multiple conversations, and this should be one of them." So let me bring up now Amy Ziering and Kirby Dick from our green room. You guys can hear me. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
So let me start by asking you, the film is now out. Audiences are able to see it. What's it been like for the film to finally reach a wide audience in the past week?
Well, it's complicated, right? I mean, obviously we're thrilled and grateful it found a home and a platform, because that was by no means certain, given how events happened and how they came down. So for that, we're extraordinarily grateful. We're grateful that the reviewers have embraced it. And, the response has been phenomenal to everyone in the film. So that's been very heartening. And so far there hasn't been the blowback and the trolling that we feared, always comes with this kind of film. So I think that actually, given how the headlines are now and the focus is perhaps that helped, people not go on the attack in the way they normally would towards the survivors. So, overall, it's been going, really, really, really well.
Yeah, we're really happy that these voices are finally being heard. I mean, it's been a long trip, but we're really glad, and HBO Max has been fantastic all the way through, supportive of the.
Can you describe how it was that you came to be filming Drew Dixon before the rest of the world knew her story?
Yeah, we never were making a film. We
go ahead.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, Amy.
Okay, sure. So it was very organic. Kirby and I like to say the stories find us. We sort of look into arena and then we figure out what we're making as we're making it. And we initially just were collecting Me Too stories. In the wake of Me Too, given the work we've done in the past, a lot of our phones were ringing and a lot of people wanted to talk to us finally and now, and they trusted us. So Drew was just one of the many women we happened to interview at the time. And I remember we rented a house in Brooklyn and we were doing a lot of interviews in one day. And she came in and did the interview. And I always would check in with the crew after an interview because I had my own sense of it, but I always wanted to know what does everyone else think? And 3 of the crew members were sobbing. And I called Kirby and I said, this one interview today was extraordinary. And, we should probably just stay in touch with her and just see what's going on. And that's how we kind of were introduced. And at that time, Drew had not made any decisions about whether she was even going to go, talk to the New York Times or even go public with her story to us. So that interview, she didn't sign a release, and when we got back to LA, I called her and she said, I don't know what I'm doing, and I said, well, look, we don't want to put any pressure on you. We don't want to change, you've gone through enough and we don't want to change your influence. Whatever you do is right. You do you. But, what if we just followed you and you don't sign a release and, we would just continue to sort of, whatever you felt comfortable with, we would cover, and whatever you didn't, we wouldn't. And no harm, no foul. At any time, you could just say, I'm not doing this. And so that's how we that's how we progressed. So it really is legitimate that she had no idea what she was going to do. And even after she decided she was going to go public with the New York Times, she still didn't sign a release with us for almost a year, where she was like not even sure if then she wanted to go forward in a film. So
you've both faced powerful institutions before in the US military and elite universities that want to tamp down stories of rape. How did those dynamics compare to facing the influence of Russell Simmons?
Well, it was a different situation because it was something that was internal to the team. Oprah Winfrey came on the project initially in February for almost a year, involved in the project all the way through. Supportive. When we showed her the initial rough cut of the On the Record, she was really, really effusive, really wanted to be a part of this. And she was supportive all the way and extremely collaborative. I mean, it was a great working relationship. Simmons started putting on pressure, and that was what really caught us off guard, because everyone had loved the film. Apple loved the film. Her production company loved the film. People who had seen the film loved the film. Everybody wanted to go to Sundance. In fact, it was, her production company and Apple that suggested the film to go to Sundance, and it's in Sundance. So we were totally caught off guard, and that was surprising.
You broke up for a second there, Kirby, but as I understand the chronology, what you were saying is it wasn't until December, when the film was announced it was going to be at Sundance, is when a lot of pressure came down from Russell Simmons. Is
right.
That right?
Just to underline, I think Kirby's point was we never would presume that this would be our story to tell alone, and it really was a collaboration. When we found, as I mentioned in that narrative, we found Drew and we started following her, shortly after we showed clips to Ms. Winfrey and Harpo executives in person, because we weren't letting any of this material go out of our hands, obviously, out of deference to all the women who told their stories to us. So, and at that point, Ms. Winfrey shook our hand and said, "Oh my God, this has to be my first series for Apple." She announced it as her first series for Apple, and we started collaborating closely together. And then in June, we called her and said, we're having a bit of trouble pushing all this material we have with Drew and her story into an episode all about entertainment. It's so rich and it's got so much. Would you just look at a cut where we pull that story out and just see what you think? And if you don't like it, we'll mush it back in, and no problem. And she called us in June and said, "Oh my God, I totally get it. This is so important. No one has really sort of been able to unpack the complexity and the intersectionality of racism when it comes to sexual violence, and I want to do that." And so we worked closely with her team and Ms. Winfrey for the next several months. She watched many cuts. She gave us notes. We worked closely with all the voices in the film, obviously, and it really was a collaboration. So when she left, the optics changed, but the optics don't really show what the reality of the filmmaking was. I just want to really point that out. And we're sensitive enough to these issues to know not to sort of go it alone or presume, that this would be our story to tell and our story to tell alone. And it really honestly was not. So just want to clarify that. And also, I guess the last thing I'll say of interest is the film is about the very problem women of color have coming forward to talk about these issues. And then the meta narrative of what happened post Sundance and post Russell pressure sort of played out in real time, that very dynamic. And we were blindsided, but we shouldn't have been. It was startling, and it was sort of really most startling and rattling to the everyone involved inside the film, because if this person felt uncomfortable coming forward, why should they presume to feel like they're safe? It was honestly a terrifying time, and I'm just grateful we made it. I'm grateful to HBO Max for their courage. I'm grateful to Sundance for not backing down and not letting these women's voices be silenced again for whatever reason.
Well, let me shift the focus back onto these women. Can you talk about the trials and tribulations that they've gone through and are still going through now?
Well, I mean, that is their story to tell still, but I will say that, they were, you can read, there's a lot that was written at the time and a lot of speaking they did brilliantly and eloquently and far better than I about how traumatizing everything was. I mean, I can't even begin to imagine it. It's, the film is about how hard it is to disclose this kind of information publicly and the ramifications and backlash you get, in particular, that are very unique to women of color. And then to sort of have that second, violation or betrayal happen in such a precipitous way with no concept or understanding, and then have the film come under sort of a whisper campaign and an attack that made no sense, was very violating and very traumatizing. But as Drew says, and as Sherry says, and everyone I talk to all the time, we're here, we're strong, and we shouldn't be surprised. And, no one said life's fair. So, and what it's instructional coming out now in the time of COVID too, right? Because what COVID did in many ways, obviously, was sort of, as you said in your intro, Tom, but to all of us was exposed that, there isn't one America. This isn't the great equalizer. This pandemic is affecting populations differently along racial lines. And same thing with the film, that our film is all about the ways in which, there can be sexual violence and sexual trauma, but that affects women of color differently than it does white women. And so, both. So we think the film is actually coming out at a good time for people to really look at intersectionality and their responsibility in helping these women come forward with less trauma.
So you described that when you started reporting the story, you were reporting many stories about the Me Too movement, not just celebrities, but non-celebrities. What's going to happen to those stories? Do you have other projects still going?
Well, we had a series with Apple with Ms. Winfrey, which got canceled as well. So I'm not sure. We're trying to repurpose it and resell it. So we'll see. I hope so. It was great. It's really amazing material, and about all, what we loved about going into this film and what we were able to do with this new project was to go very much deeper. When we first started out with our original films, like the bar was so high, you just had to say, believe women. Rape happens at these numbers that are inexcusable. And really, you need to believe people when they tell you they're raped. That was it. That was like the only message we could get across. And what we really had to hammer hard. And, what we love about On the Record is it's a much more nuanced and sophisticated unpacking of this kind of trauma and the ways it affects people differently. And likewise, the series is also much more complicated and nuanced in the ways that it plays out on women in different industries and of different, sects. So,
Kirby, as I wrap this up, I want to ask you about the protests that are going on now, dominating headlines, and I wonder how you think about the story and On the Record in relation to that story, if there is a relation.
Well, yeah, no, I definitely think there is. I mean, I think this is hopefully a watershed moment in this country where we really look at systemic racism throughout society, even going beyond the horrible police brutality against Black men. And I think part of that, as Amy said, is dealing with the challenges that women of color face, and that we look at in our film, that women of color who are survivors face. So what we hope is this film becomes part of an entire societal movement to shift. And we'll look back at this to some degree, maybe the way we look back at other like the civil rights movement, that this will be a change that will change, culture, and hopefully for centuries or forever.
Well, I thank you both very much for the film On the Record. I hope people get to see it on HBO Max. Look, we've had you before at Doc NYC in person, and we hope that happens again sometime soon.
Thank you.
Likewise.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to say goodbye to Kirby and to Amy. All right, now I'm going to bring up our final guest, Marsha Smith. Let me just take a second to invite her to the room. There she is. Or at least I see her. So, Marsha, I've just invited you. While I'm waiting for her to come on, let me say a little bit about Marsha. There she is. Hey. So I'm just gonna, want to talk about your over 20 years of experience with Stanley Nelson. You're the president of Firelight Media. You guys have been making films for over 20 years. The first was The Black Press, Soldiers Without Swords. You've made films about Black history, about Marcus Garvey and the Freedom Riders. You've made films about Black leadership, like Tell Them We Are Rising and Boss, The Black Experience. Right now, Firelight's film Black Panthers, Vanguard of the Revolution is available for free streaming on PBS. You can find a link at the resources button below. Marsha and Stanley could rest on their laurels of filmmaking, but they've also built an institution to support other filmmakers of color. Firelight has a fellowship program where they work with emerging filmmakers for over a year to develop their projects. And we've shown many of these filmmakers' work at Doc NYC. You should go to Firelight TV to explore all of them. Their new project starts today. It's a new talk show called Beyond Resilience, and it's going to be happening at 4 o'clock Eastern Time live, and I hope you'll join me in watching. You can find a link at the resources button below, but you need to RSVP before 3:30 to watch live. That's when it gets cut off, and we're going to talk more about that. Let me adjust the screen to bring you in bigger. Marsha, last weekend, your husband Stanley gave an interview in IndieWire talking about the protests happening now. He was describing that while he was being interviewed, you guys were driving back to New York City because your twin sons who are in college wanted to be out protesting. It sounded like in the interview that Stanley had some hesitations about that, as any parent would, sending kids out into a very chaotic streets. Can you talk about what's been going on in your own family this week?
Yeah. First, it's a twin son and daughter.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. And I'll get to that in a second. I do want to talk about that. But before I get to that, I want to say one thing about the previous segment.
Yeah.
It's not about the film, which I haven't seen. It's not about the filmmakers whom I respect and think are both good and have integrity. The question really is about, Tom, how you framed it. As part of how you framed the segment, you quoted the survivor who was at the center of the film as having said, had made the argument at Sundance that the film had to have been made by white filmmakers because they were less vulnerable in some way. And survivors are surely entitled to say whatever they want, have whatever opinion they have about that. But I was surprised to hear you say that, because I would assume that you know that that is patently untrue. That in fact, if the filmmakers of color are doing the work of telling stories that are related to race, and again, this is not about Kirby and Amy, but the storytelling 9 times out of 10 is better. And that, rather than, and that was the main subject of the interview with Stanley in IndieWire, is the need for filmmakers of color and Black filmmakers to tell the stories that are rolling out, thundering across the country right now. But to suggest that not only does it not matter if a filmmaker of color tells the story, but actually it might be better if a white filmmaker tells a story, is patently untrue. And I was surprised to hear that as part of how you framed that segment. So I just want to say that. I'm happy to talk about that further if you like.
I appreciate you making the point, and I fear it came across a little bit differently than I meant it. I did immediately call out as comparison to Surviving R. Kelly by Dream Hampton to show a contrast. But I wanted to bring it out because it is an obvious question to ask about that film. And I just wanted to share the way Drew Dixon had answered it. So, I appreciate your counterpoint to that. And, and really the whole reason why, we always celebrate Firelight is, the great work that you've been doing to help people tell their own stories. So,
right.
So
I just wanted to say that, in terms of the, I can't see you anymore, Tom. I'm not sure why.
Oh, I don't.
But Stanley and I are both, a generation away from the civil rights movement generation. My parents met in the 40s when they were working at the NAACP. They were activists. And I grew up in, I feel like I grew up in the movement. And so, when this started to happen and our twins who were 21 were very riled up, very upset, couldn't sleep. And my immediate reaction was, I was like, I've become my mother, because I was like, do you have to go? It's dangerous. Why don't you wait a few days? And they wore us down, which they should have done. They wore us down really well. And we came back to New York so that they could participate, because it was something that they felt they had to do. And we are fully in support of that. Though, of course, with the behavior of the NYPD, we have our hearts in our mouths, but we send them out every day. They've been out in the street every day. So there you have it. I think it is a real, it's a generational movement that we're witnessing now. I feel happy, grateful that I can witness it. I think it's critically important. I think it is leading to a real reckoning among all types of institutions, and I think that's a good thing.
You and Stanley have made all these films about the earlier chapters of the civil rights movement, Freedom Riders, Black Panthers. I wonder, when you look at those movements compared to today, what are the things that stand out to you?
Young people, for one. I think, most advances in social justice that we've made in this country, certainly going back to at least, the last half of the 20th century, have been led by young people. A few months ago, some of us might have said, well, where are they? Where are they? Well, they're all there. So I think that is striking. I think another thing that I've been thinking a lot about is that, for all of us as filmmakers, when you do a historical film, you're trying to capture a truth. You're trying to, as much as possible, capture it through the eyes of the people who lived it, even if that means they lived it from different angles. I think one thing that's very difficult to keep in mind is that that history was not a foregone conclusion at the time. That is, when those Freedom Riders got on the bus in 1961 and went south to test segregation laws, they did not know what was going to happen. They did not know 50 years hence we'd be talking about them as a key spark of a great change. They didn't know there would be a film made about them. And I think, for me, what that says is we cannot anticipate what's going to happen in the course of this movement. We have an obligation to support it. We have an obligation to see through the possibility for a transformational change that exists now, because that is not a foregone conclusion either. That is up to all of us who are alive now to keep that pushing and to do the work of, making it real, making the promise of the movement real in all the ways that means. That certainly means getting the current occupants of the White House out of office. But it also means what a few months ago were heretical, unthinkable ideas, like defund the police. we need to question why it is that in every municipal budget, that is the one piece that is protected. And that is certainly the case here in New York City. So I think, the onus is on all of us to, not sit back and watch. And that can mean a lot of things. It doesn't mean you have to get out in the street, but it means that you have to take seriously the opportunity that I think these young people have given all of us to make the kinds of transformational change that's necessary.
We were talking earlier when I was doing a tech check with you about a difference in today's movement of Black Lives Matter, that it's not a membership-based organization that's leading it the way we see in films like Freedom Riders, where you had, or earlier chapters of civil rights, where you had SNCC or CORE or the Black Panthers or Operation Push, that had membership-based organizations that had clear tactics, clear communications,
clear hierarchies.
Can you talk about, how that makes a difference in today's movement?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can't be overly romantic about what it was before. I mean, I think, the fact that we can now, in retrospect, point to an array of organizations that have leadership and structures and committees and chairs, they were not always good. It's well known, for example, that women were underrepresented in the formal leadership positions while they did most of the work in the civil rights movement. And that, the kind of style of leadership of that generation had its advantages, but it also did have disadvantages. And I think the same is true today. I think, the posture of this generation of leaders is to be decentralized, to not have visible spokespeople, because I think they're recognizing some of the bad, negative consequences of having had that in the past. I think, not having visible leaders, spokespeople can be problematic, because I think, when it comes time to kind of translating the energy and the programs into political power, we have to elect people, and we elect people. We don't elect movements or tickets like they do in parliamentary democracy. We elect people. So that's an issue. But I think the advantage of it actually is everybody's talking about what Black Lives Matter means to them. And it prompts all of us, I think, to reflect, perhaps in a greater way than it might if we could point to a leader or a group and say, okay, I'm going to give some money to this person. I'm going to follow what this person says. If it's more decentralized and it's more about the core slogans, demands, then I think it does prompt all of us to examine what it means in our respective fields. Not excluding the documentary field. The opportunity, I think, for reflection, transformation is there for all of us. And that is, in fact, our obligation.
Can you talk about what you're hearing from people in the Firelight community about, are you hearing from people who are covering this or who are, responding to it in their films making yet?
Yeah, I think that's kind of inevitable. 2 weeks ago, we were talking about COVID, and we were talking about how communities of color were being especially hard hit by COVID. I'm sure many folks listening now saw, I think it was an article in Vulture that had a list of 15 or 20 films that were in production, about to go in production about COVID. There was not one single African-American filmmaker on that list, not one. That's a problem. And I think, when it comes to how this moment is documented, I have to say, in our network, there are a lot of people who are dealing with COVID. We have people, fellows, alumni, staff people who have lost people or who have had ill family members. Today, we have people, our daughter was arrested in Atlanta a few days ago. Loida Limbal, whom some of you met on a previous Friday Fix, two of her sisters were arrested yesterday. So our vice president spent the night trying to get her sisters out of jail. So people are dealing with that. I think, for many of us, people are shooting, absolutely, people are shooting. But I think for many of us, it's so overwhelming, A, and B, we are not positioned to pick up the phone and say to the head of, pick a distributor, I have a great idea for a film on Black Lives Matter or George Floyd. What do you think? I mean, and again, here, not to criticize your first guest, but I think the idea that a filmmaker is qualified to go from making a film on Formula E racing to making a film on why African Americans are especially hard hit by COVID is something that we should all question. To me, that's a question. And because who tells these stories makes a difference in how people understand the world and the narrative that then gets played out over and over again about people of color, which is how we got here.
In last week, we saw the Tribeca Film Institute suspend its operations of supporting filmmakers. They said because the funds are restricting in this time of the pandemic. Can you talk about how Firelight is doing? Do you feel your funders backing off?
I don't feel our funders backing off at all. In fact, I think our funders have stepped up. And I think what was so disappointing about the TFI announcement was, I can tell you as a president of an organization, I've spent a lot of my waking hours worrying about how to protect this organization because of the constituents that we serve, because of the people that are relying on us. And I'm disappointed not to have seen an official statement from TFI. I may have missed that, but I saw what I saw was not official. So it's definitely a loss. I can tell you Firelight's funders, and we, unlike many organizations, we are more reliant on private foundations than we are individual contributions, which used to be terrible. Wish we had more, still wish we had more, but in this moment, our private foundation donors have really stepped up. And I think I'm grateful for that. It's allowed us to pivot to try to be as responsive as we can be to our constituencies in a very difficult moment.
As we wrap up here, I want to ask you about this new initiative. I'm going to try to bring to the screen the image again. This is Beyond Resilience, the new show that starts at 4 o'clock in 1 hour. People have a half hour that they can still RSVP. Talk about what this is and and why you guys wanted to do this.
Yeah, I think, let me plug in my computer. It's about to die. We have for about a year now been experimenting with a screening series that was intended as a kind of showcase opportunity for our fellows, alumni, as well as some of Stanley's older work. And when the pandemic hit and we had to rethink how we were going to deliver those programs, we realized, one, that this could actually, it was an opportunity to have a national audience and not just a local audience, but also that we could try to take advantage of the limitations imposed by COVID, as well as the real desire, I think, on the part of the folks that we work with to engage in conversations about what the opportunities are of this moment. Obviously, it's a lot of hardship for a lot of individual people, for a lot of organizations, for a lot of parts of the documentary ecosystem, but we think there also may be some points of opportunity here. And so we wanted to establish a way where we could screen some work, not full films, but screen some work where we could have discussion, where we could imagine the kind of documentary film ecosystem that might serve filmmakers of color better. And we'll have today 3 filmmakers who were set to premiere at Tribeca. And for whom, as for many of us, these big film festivals are a huge opportunity because they confer legitimacy, they confer credibility, they confer quality, they are networking opportunities. And without them, although I should say there are limitations to that too, because present company accepted. If film festivals play a role that has not always been to the advantage of at least most of our filmmakers. So we want to have some discussion about how the ecosystem might change in ways that are more filmmaker friendly and support more work. And that's what the Beyond Resilience series is really about. That it's called Beyond Resilience because people of color are often lauded for being so resilient, but we actually think we shouldn't have to be so resilient. So we want to talk about Beyond Resilience.
Well, I'm looking forward to watching that at 4. I realized when I put up a graphic before, I had been sent 2 graphics. One had a wrong date. So the graphic I put up before, I accidentally sent June 4th. That's why I took it down. But it's June 5th. It's happening today. If you go to the resources button, people can still RSVP.
Yes. I just urge you to please do it quickly. Right before this program started, I checked and we had 900 RSVPs. That's
amazing.
Yeah. So if you haven't RSVP'd and you want to, please join us.
Yeah. Well, Marsha, I'm sorry that I disappointed you early in the segment. And I'm sorry that we had to start off on a note of criticism. But I, take all your words to heart always. And I really appreciate you being on this. I really appreciate all the work that you and Stanley and Loida and everyone at Firelight are doing.
Well, we're all learning here, Tom. So thank you for having me, and happy to keep talking. Thanks for having this.
Okay, well, I'm sure we'll have a lot more to say about Firelight and your filmmakers in weeks to come. So good luck with your launch day. I can tell you it's nerve-wracking.
Yes, extremely. Thank you.
Okay, take care. All right, I'm going to say goodbye. And then as I wrap up here, tell you about a few things coming up. So what we got here? All right, we have a new Doc NYC class coming up on safe and secure production on June 16th and 17th. Filmmakers and advisors will discuss what it means to be producing during COVID-19. I should say we conceived this class last month before the recent protests, and we are going to be updating this to add further guests that take that reality into account. You can enroll to watch live on June 16th and 17th or watch later. You can go to the resources button below for more information. I encourage you to start your week with Doc NYC's Monday Memo. It contains all the week's documentary news in an email. Last week, we added a video reel for Monday Memo. We'll see how long I can keep that going. But you can watch on Doc NYC's YouTube channel and on docnyc.net. You can sign up to receive our free newsletter. The show has been recorded and will be available on this link. We'll also post a written transcript that you can access on docnyc.net. That will be up in a few days. Please come back next Friday, June 12th. We'll be announcing our guests next week. Thanks to the Doc NYC team, Sarah Modo, Caitlin Boyle, and Raphael Nehausen. Thanks to our guests, Fisher Stevens, Kirby Dick, Amy Ziering, and Marsha Smith. We hope you'll join us again for your next Friday Fix. Have a great weekend.